Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Chelsea. I'm a genetic counselor at Hoag. And today I'm going to be talking about hereditary cancer, genetic testing, what we do at genetic counseling, and I will have time at the end for questions. So to start, before we can talk about hereditary cancer, I just want to do a brief overview of genetics. And so in the bottom left-hand corner here, we have a cartoon picture of a DNA strand, and you can think of DNA as your body's instruction manual. It contains all the chemical information to tell your body how to function. A gene is kind of like the chapter in your body's instruction manual, or just a section of DNA. So you have genes for hair color, eye color, height, cancer protection, things like that. So today we're going to focus on the genes that tell your body how to prevent cancer. And so if we zoom in even closer on the DNA, there are these chemicals that we designate with these letters. And so we can actually read through the chemical letters in someone's DNA to see if they have the correct sequence or an incorrect sequence. And so what genetic testing is essentially a spell check of all of your cancer protection genes. So we read through all the chemical letters of the DNA to check for any typos. If there are typos present, then that person might have a higher chance of developing cancer because their protective instruction is wrong. And so for example, let's say we have a really simple instruction, pet the red cat. And we read through someone else's instruction and theirs says pet the red cat, then they do the right function. But if that C is switched just to an H, it's a one-letter change. Now the instruction has changed to pet the red hat. So if we want someone to go pet the cat and they're petting the hat, they're doing the wrong thing. Same thing with your cancer protection genes. Sometimes if there's even just a one-letter typo, your body doesn't know how to prevent that type of cancer anymore. So here is a little picture of a screenshot from two different test results. The first one is showing that at position 5,230 in the BRCA1 gene, DEL means deletion of an A. So this person is missing one A in the middle of their BRCA1 gene, and they have a higher risk of developing cancer. Below, the next one, at position 1,283, a C is switched to a T in this individual's CHEK2 gene. So these little typos can make a big difference because both of these individuals now have an increased risk of developing cancer because there's a typo in their, or a mutation in their cancer protection gene. So the other thing about these genes is that most of them come in pairs, which means you inherit one copy of every cancer protection gene from your mother and one copy from your father. The circles and squares on this picture are just a pedigree or a diagram of the family tree. So circles represent women, squares represent men, and the rows are the generations. So the pink empty circle in the middle is the woman in question, or the patient. She has two breast cancer genes, one that she got from her mother, one from her father. And she has a mutation in one copy. It happens to be the copy she inherited from her father. So she has a higher chance of developing breast cancer. Not a guaranteed chance because she still has a backup gene, but higher than the average woman who has two good copies. Now when her and her partner go on to have children, they each have to pass on one copy of this gene. And it's random which copy they pass on each time. So from her partner, it doesn't really matter which copy he passes on because he only has good copies to give. But from our patient, she can either pass on the faulty copy that she inherited from her father or the good copy that she inherited from her mother. It's a 50-50 chance. And so when someone carries a mutation in one of these genes, most of them are inherited this way, which is a dominant fashion, which means there's a 50-50 chance of passing it on to the next generation. If someone doesn't inherit the mutation, like her child on the right, she now can't pass it on to any of her future children. It can't skip a generation in that sense. Once you have good, perfect genes, you can only pass perfect genes on to your children. So when we're thinking about cancer as a whole, this pie chart is a rough estimation of what the causes are of all types of cancer. And so about 5 to 10% of the time, cancer is hereditary, which means it's caused by a mutation or a spelling mistake in one of these genes that is supposed to be preventing cancer, but it's not working. Sometimes cancer is familial, which means it's running in the family, but we can't find a gene to explain why. So sometimes we see 3 generations of breast cancer in a family, and they come in and do genetic testing, and we don't find an answer. And in those families, we think either maybe it's a shared environmental risk factor, right? Families often live in the same area, maybe the same house, maybe they eat the same food, maybe it's just a similar environmental risk factor. Or in some families, maybe there's a gene running in the family that we haven't discovered yet. So we tell families to come back because the testing gets better every couple years and we discover new genes, and maybe the cancer in their family is hereditary, we just don't know the gene yet. And then finally, most cancer is sporadic, which means it just happens by chance. It's not due to your genes, but maybe due to something in your environment. So that could be diet and lifestyle factors, chemicals in your job, pollution in the air, and really, who knows sometimes. We don't always have an answer for why someone gets cancer. All right. So when we're trying to figure out who's a good candidate for genetic testing, we try and look at a family tree for red flags. So these are things that we see in the family that basically indicates that there's a good chance that maybe the cancer is hereditary. So the first thing that we look for is young ages at diagnosis. So a woman who gets breast cancer before 45, man or woman with colon cancer before 50, uterine cancer under 50, and a sarcoma before 45. All of these things are good indications for a genetic testing referral because it could be hereditary. We also look for rare cancers. So ovarian cancer, a woman's risk for ovarian cancer is about 1%, so that's considered a rare cancer. Male breast cancer, this is very rare, but men can get breast cancer, and when we see it, we're worried that it could be hereditary. And pancreatic cancer, another kind of rare one, but we've discovered more genes recently kind of linked to pancreatic cancer, and there's now testing. Another red flag is multiple diagnoses in the same person. So kind of like being struck by lightning twice, right? It's bad luck to get it once, and it's really bad luck to get it twice, or maybe it's a gene that's involved that is putting someone at risk. So if we see a woman with both breast and ovarian cancer, colon and endometrial or uterine cancer, if someone gets bilateral cancer, so cancer in both breasts or cancer in both kidneys, that's another indication. Someone with 3 or more melanomas, a male with prostate and pancreatic cancer, or someone with more than 10 to 20 colon polyps. There are some genes that can put people at higher risk for colon polyps, which then can put them at higher risk for colon cancer. Ethnicity. So some cancer gene mutations are more common in certain populations. So specifically, there are a lot of founder mutations identified in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, which is the Eastern European Jewish population. There was a study done recently that found that 12 to 20% of Ashkenazi Jewish individuals carried a mutation in a cancer risk gene. So fairly high, good reason to do genetic testing. I do see people sometimes who are of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, but they have no family history of cancer. Their odds would definitely be lower given that there's no family history of these things, but when we see the Jewish ancestry in combination with the family history of cancer, we are sometimes worried about these genes as well. Family history. So if someone has multiple relatives on the same side of the family with the same or related cancers, that's a sign that it could be hereditary. If the cancers are on opposite sides, then less likely to be hereditary because those people don't share DNA, versus if it's all relatives on the same side, maybe more likely to be hereditary. And so this is our first example family. This is kind of a bigger family tree, but our patient is in the bottom left with the red circle around her. The little black arrow is pointing to her as well. She was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 30. So that's our first red flag, is the early age at diagnosis. Next, she has a maternal aunt with breast cancer at 42 and a cousin with breast cancer at 40, so 2 more early ages, or under 45 for breast cancer. Her mother had ovarian cancer, so one of the rare cancers. That was another red flag. Her great aunt had bilateral breast cancer, so breast cancer in both breasts. Again, very unlucky for that just to happen by chance. And she is of Russian Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So she has a lot of red flags in her family. I think when we calculated her chances of carrying a mutation, it was something like 98% chance she's going to come back positive for something. So lots of risk factors in this family. She did come back positive, I believe, for a BRCA mutation. The BRCA genes are two more common breast and ovarian cancer genes. They were the first breast cancer genes discovered. So we know a lot about them, and a lot of people come in asking about these ones, but we actually know of almost 20 breast cancer genes now. So for this woman, we probably would have tested her for more than just BRCA, given that there's lots of breast cancer in the family. It could have been one of the other genes that explains the history too. This next family has familial atypical multiple mole melanoma, or FAM syndrome, which is caused by mutations in the CDKN2A gene. So in this family, what we're looking for is 3 or more melanomas, or someone who's had melanoma 3 or more times. And so you can see our guy there, he doesn't have a circle around them. He's the 55-year-old male in the bottom right. He has 3 siblings who've had multiple melanomas. His brother had his first one at 36, and his sister started getting melanoma at 35 and 36. His mother passed from melanoma at 46, an aunt had melanoma, and an uncle had melanoma. So very strong history there. Most skin cancers are from the sun, but this kind of history is a little bit more suspicious. We also have the pancreatic cancer in his grandfather. So this gene specifically increases risk for melanoma and pancreatic cancer. So if we see these in a family running together, it's a clue that, again, this gene could be involved. Okay. Next family, this is a family with Lynch syndrome. This is the most common hereditary colon cancer syndrome. A lot of people don't know this, but Lynch syndrome is actually more common than BRCA. You just hear about the BRCA or the BRCA genes in the media a lot more. And so in Lynch syndrome families, we see a lot of colon and uterine or endometrial cancer. So there are 3 endometrial cancers in this family. Our patient, who was diagnosed at 30, her mother, and her aunt. And we also have the 2 colon cancers in her uncle and her grandmother. And we also see young ages here. So the colons were both under 50. Her endometrial cancer was under 50. So those are things we're looking for. Plus, there's 3 generations affected. So lots of indications that maybe these genes could be involved. And so this is kind of our small hereditary cancer cheat sheet. So these are a few of the syndromes we see at Hoag specifically, and what to look for in these families. So if there are, for example, hereditary breast and ovarian cancer families, we look for female and male breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, melanoma, and the Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So this can sometimes be like a good guide for doctors too, what to look for, when to refer to genetic counseling. Lynch syndrome, that's the one we just mentioned with the colon and uterine cancer, but also in those families we can see ovarian cancer, GI cancers, cancer of the renal pelvis, the pancreas, glioblastomas. Those are things we see in Lynch syndrome families too. Li-Fraumeni syndrome, bottom left, this one's pretty rare. We see a lot of cancers in these families, and we can also see really young cancers, like even in childhood in Li-Fraumeni families. So these are some of the things we look for to see if they're running together.
What is Li-Fraumeni syndrome?
Li-Fraumeni syndrome. It's just named after the 2 doctors that discovered it, Li and Fraumeni. This list are the cancers we see with that syndrome, yeah. And it's caused by mutations in the TP53 gene, so one of the ones we test for. So like I said, when a woman comes in with breast cancer, that would be one we would test for because breast cancer is seen in that syndrome. Okay. So the genetic counseling process. So if someone wants to do this testing, we do recommend that they see a genetic counselor for a few reasons, but I'll kind of go through how the process works and why it might be helpful. So first of all, genetic counselors are healthcare professionals with advanced training in medical genetics and counseling. We have a master's degree, we're board certified, and we're licensed in the state of California. There are different specializations of genetic counselors, such as cancer, prenatal genetics, cardiovascular genetics, neurogenetics, things like that. And we do a lot of continuing education because the genetics field is evolving rapidly, so we watch a lot of webinars, conferences, et cetera, to keep up to date with all the things that are changing. What we try to do is explain genetics, answer questions. We analyze your family. We perform a risk assessment to assess the chances that the cancer in the family could be hereditary. We discuss the legal, ethical implications of genetic testing. We arrange genetic testing, we explain results, and we provide a written summary. We are not therapists and we are not physicians, so the counseling name sometimes can mislead people, but it's not the typical counseling session. At Hoag, our genetic counseling program began in 2002. We have seen over 10,000 patients to date. We're helping a lot of families, and then we help people basically with early detection or prevention. So that's the whole goal with this. If we find out someone has a higher risk for cancer, we want to do everything we can to prevent it or catch it at the earliest possible stage so that the treatment is more successful. So Hoag has a lot of early detection prevention programs. So if we find that someone is a gene mutation carrier, we can then refer them to a specific program where they can kind of get individualized screening to, again, try and catch things early or prevent them. We see patients in Newport Beach and Irvine. For referrals, if someone has an HMO insurance plan, they need to ask their doctor for a referral to genetic counseling under the CPT code 96040. If someone has a PPO insurance plan, they can either ask their doctor for a referral or they can call us directly. We accept self-referrals as well. A lot of people worry about insurance coverage and costs. Genetic testing used to be very expensive, but thankfully the cost has come down. So it's a two-part billing process. The first part is genetic counseling. So typically this is a covered service by all major insurance companies except for Medicare. Medicare does not cover genetic counseling visits. So at Hoag, we've arranged for a discounted cost for individuals with Medicare or people paying out of pocket if they don't have insurance.
Are HMOs considered Medicare?
If you have an HMO Medicare plan, usually you can get authorization for counseling. Yeah. For those that have to pay, the visit is $215, an additional $25 fee for the blood draw, so like to pay for the needle and the Band-Aid and the nurse's time. For genetic testing, this is covered for individuals who meet the necessary criteria, and it's insurance specific. So there are national guidelines for when someone should have genetic testing, and then each insurance company made their own version of the guidelines, and they don't always follow the national guidelines perfectly. So we check everybody's insurance and let them know if they're meeting criteria. Right now, there's a laboratory that's doing no-cost testing for individuals with straight Medicare plans. They're trying to prove to Medicare that their guidelines are kind of strict, so we're trying to get testing and show them why this testing is helpful. For those with Medicare HMO plans, the discount they do is $100 for the testing. And then if someone doesn't have insurance or doesn't meet criteria, the cost for genetic testing is $250. So it used to cost $5,000 to test for 2 genes, and now it's about $250 for 100 or so genes, so it has come down a lot. Once you schedule, the first thing we do is have you fill out a family history questionnaire. So you list all your relatives, their age or the age when they passed, the type of cancer they had, and how old they were when they were diagnosed. And with that form, we build your family tree, which you also get a copy of. We review your medical records, if you've had cancer, your diagnosis, type of cancer, your treatment, and then we analyze your history and your family history for all known hereditary cancer conditions. So we look at all the patterns, we look at the ages, we run computer risk assessment models if we have them to predict the chances of finding a mutation to prepare for your appointment. Then you meet with us, we discuss your family history, your risk assessment, genetics, options for testing, and then you get results back usually in about 2 to 3 weeks. So we can either call you with results or you can come back for a follow-up appointment and we go over kind of what your results mean. So here's an example of kind of a confusing result. Variants of uncertain significance identified in BRCA2, CFTR, and MSH6. So this required kind of some follow-up to explain what that all means. After interpreting your results, we also go over implications for you. So let's say we don't find anything in your family history, or we don't have an explanation for the cancer running in your family. In those cases, we will still predict your chances of developing that type of cancer based on what we know. So, for example, we know if someone has a parent or a sibling with colon cancer and we don't find a colon cancer gene mutation, their risk is roughly double to triple the average person's risk for colon cancer because of possible shared environmental risk factors or genes we don't know about yet. So we'll kind of explain what the residual risks are for people and if they should be doing extra screening. And we go over what it means for their family too. So if someone was the best candidate for testing and no one else needs testing, or if others should still be tested, kind of what that all means. If a mutation is found, we will help get family members tested. We can send out letters to explain your results to your family and help them find genetic counselors. We send you a summary report. It's usually like a 5 or 6 page document explaining what you were tested for, your family history, what it all means, what we recommend for follow-up. We usually tell people to keep these because if you forget everything we said 5 years from now, you still have the written documentation. You get a copy of your test result, and then we also send you a copy of your family tree diagram. For patients who test positive, we also do a little USB drive with other resources, so the national guidelines for that gene mutation, the letter for their family, support groups, all sorts of resources we put on there. For people where we don't find a gene mutation, sometimes we refer them to gene-finding research studies if we think their family history is really suspicious for being hereditary. In some cases, we also offer DNA banking, so people can provide a sample of DNA so that their relatives can go back and test it 50 years from now when we discover more genes and they might not be around anymore. So that's really helpful for some families too. But we tell everyone, follow up forever. I'm sure there's updates to people's family history. There's also updates to test results. We also discover new genes. So we want people to come back. A good example is in the early 2000s, most women with breast cancer were only testing for BRCA1 and 2. And again, today we know of multiple breast cancer genes. So a lot of people were sent a letter telling them to come back to do update testing. We think, again, this is going to keep happening, so we want families to check in with us every couple years and come back if there's new genes discovered that would be relevant for them. Okay. So now an example patient. My mother died from breast cancer when she was 45. I'm 45 now and I'm worried. I want to have genetic testing. So she has a couple options of what she can do. Specifically, she could do direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So order a genetic testing kit online, have it sent to her house, send it back. She could ask her doctor to order genetic testing, or she could see a genetic counselor. So we'll kind of go through these different options. With direct-to-consumer genetic testing, you may have seen these before. There's lots of marketing around Christmas time and Mother's Day and things like that. These are genetic tests marketed directly to consumers. They provide patients access to genetic information without involving a medical professional or insurance plans. You can learn about health, traits, ancestry, what type of wine you're going to like based on your genetics, all sorts of things like that. These tests aren't perfect, but I do appreciate that people are also interested in genetics and want to learn about themselves and their genetic history, so definitely not all bad. How these work is you choose a test and order a kit online. They send you a saliva collection tube. Saliva and blood, for the most part, are equally accurate. They're either looking at DNA in your blood cells or your cheek cells. Some of the tests we order at Hoag, we do recommend blood because sometimes they can run extra testing on the blood, but it's equally accurate. It's the same DNA. The lab will analyze the sample, generate a report, send the report back to the person, and then they get to kind of interpret what it means based on what the report tells them. The technology that they're using is SNPs, which stand for single nucleotide polymorphisms. So I was kind of explaining at the beginning how there can be these little spelling changes or letter changes in the DNA. With these labs, they're looking for these little SNP changes, but sometimes they don't look at the whole gene. So they might not read all the letters from start to finish. They might just look in certain spots where the letters are often switched. So it's not a comprehensive analysis all the time. All right, so this is one of the tests that people can do, a child development test. There was a genetic counselor who decided to do this test on her child. And when she got results back, basically said, nothing was flagged out of the ordinary with Ginger's DNA. Ginger appears to be a pretty average kid in terms of her intellectual and athletic potential. And this is Ginger. The lab didn't even notice that it was a dog sample instead of a human sample. So, although our DNA is similar to other animals, probably should have been flagged that this was not a human sample. So, just to give you an idea of, some of these companies and the quality control. 23andMe is a big one that a lot of people use and have heard of. Again, it's a saliva test. You spit in the tube. You get an email with your results. This is a screenshot from one of the genetic counselors I work with. She was looking at her BRCA results. 23andMe does test for BRCA. And it basically said, Jeannie, you do not have the 3 genetic variants we tested. So, negative results. So if she was the person in question, she basically says, yay, can I cancel my genetic counseling appointment? And the answer is no, because they only looked at 3 variants. So between the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, there are 18,000 letters of DNA. 23andMe looked at 3 letters to see if there were any spelling mistakes. So although it's accurate in those 3 spots, it is not comprehensive. Those are the 3 mutations that are more common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, but that still misses a huge amount of people, with them only testing for 3 variants out of thousands of possible variants. This was taken from the New York Times in 2019, where they basically say 90% of participants who carried a BRCA mutation would have been missed by 23andMe's test. So definitely not comprehensive. The other issue with direct-to-consumer testing is privacy. So they are able to share your data, sell your data to pharmaceutical companies, things like that. Through clinical testing, it's all private and confidential. The other worry is accuracy. This is an article of a sample swap at 23andMe. What if you're getting someone else's information and then making health choices based on that? We do recommend if someone does happen to have one of those BRCA mutations through 23andMe, we do recommend that they confirm it with clinical grade testing before they make any changes to their management. So things to keep in mind. Option 2 for our patient is genetic testing through her doctor's office. So what we kind of like to say with regard to this is your doctor is an expert in their area. So maybe surgery, gynecology, oncology, but may not always be an expert in genetics. So they have to keep up to date with the things that are changing in their field, but possibly not always in genetics, versus we're trying to stay up to date with genetics. That's our job. A doctor recently said genetic testing costs $4,000, which is also not true. It's $250 at most for testing. So something else we like to consider is, think about it. Do you want your neurologist performing your pap smear, right? Your neurologist is a great doctor, but you might not want them doing that. Or do you want your dermatologist interpreting your mammogram, things like that. You want to see definitely an expert in genetics to make sure you get the right test, nothing's missed. And we want to help you get the lowest cost possible by working with your insurance and picking a lab that's in-network and contracted and all of that. And so this slide's a little wordy, but these are just kind of our comparisons. So with the direct-to-consumer, there's no doctor or genetic counselor involved. It's the 23andMe specifically is about $200. Doesn't check all the mutations. Takes about 4 weeks to get results. You get some general information. It is done in the privacy of your own home, but then your results are not always private. At your doctor's office, you might not get pre-test genetic counseling. Your doctor is very busy and has a lot to cover in your visit. They may not have time to fully assess your family history. I've had that happen before, where someone tells their doctor they're worried about breast cancer, and the doctor orders a breast cancer test, and then I see them, and their family history was suspicious for a different cancer syndrome, and the doctor didn't add those genes, and then we had to go back and do another test, and insurance didn't want to pay for it again, and it was just kind of a mess. Then we also try and help with family follow-up. The doctor's office might not be equipped to handle that. So with us, we'll make sure we get the right testing. Your insurance might cover everything, depending. We can test for multiple genes. Results take 1 to 3 weeks. We will interpret them for you, and everything is HIPAA compliant. So that's kind of our comparison. So genetic testing is important. We want to make sure it's done right. And so kind of to wrap up here a little bit, genetic counseling can tell you the chance the cancer in your family is hereditary, the best testing options based on insurance and family history, what the risks are for cancer depending on the gene. We can help make a management plan based on your family history. We can discuss the risk for your relatives and what genetic testing can tell you. Potentially, it could tell you the cause of your cancer or the cancer in your family if we do find a gene mutation that explains it. Sometimes genetic test results can impact someone's treatment. So sometimes doctors will do like a more aggressive surgery for cancer treatment if someone does have a gene mutation. Again, for example, if a woman has a breast cancer gene mutation, she might choose to do a bilateral mastectomy instead of a lumpectomy to lower the chances of getting breast cancer again if she is genetically predisposed. Now there's also certain chemotherapy drugs that can target certain gene mutations, so sometimes the oncologists want to know that because it can help determine the treatment plan. Testing can also tell you personal risks based on certain gene mutations. Again, risk for relatives. And then, in summary, we are available for anyone interested in learning more or having testing. As a reminder, most cancer is not hereditary. It's only about 5 to 10% of the time that we find answers. And to recap, the red flags we're looking for are young ages at diagnosis, rare cancers, multiple diagnoses in the same person, the Ashkenazi Jewish ethnicity, and a strong family history. So with that, I left some time for questions, if anyone has questions.
Has there been any
That's a good question, yeah. So something else we like to discuss is genetic discrimination. And so people are sometimes worried about how this testing could affect jobs or insurance. And so there is a law in the US called GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prevents discrimination by health insurance companies and employers based on genetic test results. Unfortunately, that law does not cover life insurance, long-term care, and disability insurance. So people technically could be denied a life insurance policy if they know that they carry a gene mutation and have a high chance of developing cancer. Ways around that, we tell people you could get life insurance before you do genetic testing, things like that. So
on this,
if you're paying for all of it, technically, yes.
and that would include me?
Yeah. If you have like a non-Medicare plan, most likely they'll cover the counseling visit, but not always the testing. And if you have Medicare, they don't cover the counseling, but you can get free testing. So for a lot of people, it's $250 on one side or the other.